Now listen. I know this theory isn't very popular, and most people treat it as a joke, but I need everyone to lock in. I used to be a believer in Death Knight theory, and even Death Friend Knight theory, but after assessing all of the evidence I've been converted into a Rudy Knight believer. Let me lay out the evidence chapter by chapter. When we first encounter Rudy in the hospital in chapter 1, Rudy asks Chris if Toriel made them visit him. Most people interpreted this as Chris visiting for the first time, or as an infrequent event. However, I don't believe anything about what he said indicated that it was rare or the first time that he had seen Chris at the hospital. This is backed up by Niall's reaction to seeing Chris there. She is slightly confused and surprised, but doesn't say much more. I feel as though more of a reaction would happen if this was uncommon of Chris to do. This is backed up by evidence shown in the weird route in chapter 2, when Niall speaks to herself and says she needs to find out why Chris keeps coming to the hospital. The word keeps implies Chris has been visiting on multiple occasions, which makes sense in the context of visiting Rudy in the hospital in chapter 1 first, but Noelle says this even if you haven't visited Rudy in chapter 1. This means that even before the events of chapter 1, Chris has probably been going to see Rudy then. In chapter 2, when we check the sink, Rudy asks if we're practicing for tonight's hand washing marathon. A bit of an odd comment to make, but later in the chapter we know that Chris removes us from their body after leaving the sink running, then goes to slash their mother's car tires. This was all some kind of plan to get Toriel to call the police so that Undyne would come to the house. On top of that, before Chris makes the dark fountain in the living room, they make sure to first open the door to the house. This is what allows both Undyne and the Knight to enter the Dreamer home towards the end of chapter 3. Also, in chapter 2, Rudy ends up making a comment about taking Susie to the movies, and taking him along too, which is fine if it was just a silly joke, but when the chapter ends with Chris and Susie watching movies before entering a TV-themed dark world, it's something we should probably think on a little more. People also bring up the fact he mentions going to church tomorrow, which is definitely an interesting detail as he's brought up the themes and locations of each dark world that the Knight has been in. But personally I don't think this tidbit is very strong evidence because he could very easily be talking about the church service which he did attend, but you know. Now, we already know based on Chris' weird behavior at the end of chapter 2 and during the Roaring Knight boss fight that Chris is most likely working with the Knight to some degree. We know this because Chris deals much less damage to the Knight while their teammates still have HP, and the flavor text before the Knight's final attack in a no-hit run shows Chris coughing as if to indicate that the Knight should end the fight here, as the player has been too persistent and has not been defeated yet. In chapter 4, after Chris throws us away, we can listen in on Asgore's conversation with himself through the vents. In the bathroom, he talks about needing to concentrate on searching for something, in order to settle something once and for all. If we follow him to Rudy and Carol's bedroom, he holds a black shard and reflects on the past and his ongoing investigations, likely into December Holiday's disappearance. Holding this black shard, which we know comes from the Knight's sword if we defeat them in chapter 3, he reminiscently refers to an old friend, as if the object he's holding is something representative of somebody he knows very well. Knowing what we know about Asgore, he doesn't have very many friends, especially not ones that go way back with him. Nobody in town really talks about him like a close friend, instead more like an odd neighbor they don't know much about. Nobody except Rudy. We know from dialogue in the hospital that Rudy and Asgore attended higher education together, which is also true in Undertale. We know from the Undertale website page displaying the content from the discontinued Undertale alarm clock app that Rudy and Asgore went to Hotland University together, and that Rudy and Asgore would celebrate Christmas together, with Asgore lovingly referring to Rudy as the Rudolph to his Santa Claus. We also find out that Rudy canonically knows the size of Asgore's ding-a-ling. Which, Toby, why the hell did we need to know this? What was the reason, Toby? What the hell? Anyways, Asgore goes on several tangents about how much he misses Rudy, which confirms that these two were definitely very close. Based on what we know in Deltarune, and the fact that a lot of information and relationships from Undertale are carried over into this game, Rudy and Asgore were definitely very close for a long time in Deltarune as well. Therefore, I have reason to suspect that Asgore's old friend in question is Rudy Holiday. In addition, in chapter 4 when we talk to Rudy, all seems genuinely normal. I don't have much to comment on here. Nothing to say at all, unless we take a different route. You see, if we never spoke to Rudy back in chapter 2 when Susie was with us, Rudy would have never met her. He would have never discovered the face attached to the name. He wouldn't know who this kid was. So, when visiting him in chapter 4 without that introduction prior, he acts suspiciously different. If you ask to talk about Susie, he questions why Chris would bring her here, before commenting on how crazy it was for Chris to do that, finding it so ridiculous that he laughs. If you select the Susie dialogue option again, he just scowls, saying nothing more than what was already said. Sure, maybe this is because he still doesn't know who this girl is, but you would think he would care to ask at the very least. Rudy is very familiar with Chris, so even though he hasn't been introduced to Susie through his daughter, you would still think he'd be somewhat interested in who Chris' friends are, right? Especially considering he is sort of like an uncle figure to them. But no, he doesn't care to know more. He doesn't ask any questions. It seems as though he doesn't want to know anything about this girl. In my personal view, I believe this is because he has already encountered her before, back in chapter 3, back while she was actively shouting at and insulting him during the Roaring Night boss fight. Of course, he wouldn't care to maintain the act of good rapport with Susie if that was never built up in the first place back in chapter 2. And if he was only made aware of this girl while she was getting in his way, it makes sense he wouldn't be very talkative with her. The only motivation that would get him to do so is if he previously showed no issue with her, like when Noelle introduces her. If we combine the ideas that Chris has been frequently visiting Rudy at the hospital, along with Rudy's weird allusions to Chris' actions which have directly benefited the Knight, the possible identity of the Knight becomes much clearer. We know that Chris is most likely working for the Knight in some capacity, and we know that Rudy is very close with Asgore and the Dreamer family in general. We also know that Rudy's behavior drastically changes depending on whether he had encountered Susie or not before the first encounter with the Knight takes place. This evidence is circumstantial of course, but coming from a game series known for hidden lore which relies on inference making, I do believe this evidence gives a lot of merit to the theory that Rudy is the Knight. On top of that, I also believe it implicates Asgore into the Knight's plans. From here, we can build on top of the analysis to seek out motivations. Why would Rudy, and maybe Asgore alongside him, be doing all this? Why would they be meddling in the Dark Worlds, possibly trying to cause the Roaring? What would they gain from this? What are they looking for? I believe they are looking for December. A devastated father who lost his child to unforeseen circumstances, most likely kidnapped by a friend into the shelter for who knows what reasons. A police chief who was not believed in, who witnessed or may have had rocky evidence in relation to the situation, which was dismissed by everyone else in the town and led to his divorce. These two were both severely affected by Des' disappearance, and so looking for her in the Dark Worlds and learning about the Dark Worlds in general is their best bet to finding her, restoring the Holiday family and finally obtaining proof that Asgore was right. Rudy taking the more hands-on approach of looking for her by entering the Dark Worlds, Asgore taking the more analytical approach as we can see in the back of his shop with all of his documents and papers inside. It's almost as though Rudy is guiding Asgore in a way. After all, if he is the Knight, then Rudy is obtaining the more hands-on experience and information about the Dark Worlds and relaying it back to Asgore for analysis and coming up with the next part of their plan. I can't help but notice how such a dynamic reflects Rudolph and Santa Claus, Rudolph being the one to guide Santa in the dark so that Santa can do his job. In this case, Rudy is guiding Asgore in relation to the Dark World so that Asgore can do his job as the former police chief to find Rudy's lost child. I personally feel like this would be a really interesting turn for Deltarune and hope that it's correct. I'm willing to accept something like Des Knight or Des Friend Knight if it ends up making sense in relation to the plot, but this interpretation of things would really make me appreciate both Rudy and the Knight a lot more. I think Rudy's motivations are especially clear, and would make him a compelling antagonist. This video was a little rushed because I wanted to get my thoughts out there before the chapter 5 release, so I hope I've presented my theory in a way that makes sense. At the time of making this video it's still my exam season, but since Deltarune is tomorrow I put everything aside to work on this. I'm really excited for the next chapter and can't wait to play it. The chapter 5 announcement came out yesterday, and I think it looks really exciting. I'm very fond of these little snake guys we saw in the trailer, and quite a bit of lore was referenced in the small snippet we got. I really hope we get more significant Rudy screen time in chapter 5, but maybe that's because, well, he's my favorite LMAO. That's all I'll say for now, but maybe I'll give my thoughts on chapter 5 after its release. Let me know your thoughts on this theory down in the comments, and thanks for watching.